Well, let me ask you this, because I think one of the things that's amazing to me is the generosity of the reformers, even to Roman Catholicism. Because one of the things, another of these caricatures, is we're trying to chip away at this definitional question of what is Protestantism, and we're under the heading of Catholicity here. One of the caricatures is the Protestants said, well, it's us rather than any of the non-Protestants out there. Let me read two quotes, and then I'll invite you to comment on this. Luther, asked by two Lutheran ministers about baptism, is a Roman Catholic baptism still a baptism? In the context of saying yes, this is in the early 1520s. He says, late 1520s. He says, quote, in the papacy there is true Christianity, even the right kind of Christianity, and many great and devoted saints. The Christendom that is under the papacy is truly under the body of Christ and a member of it. Calvin, in the Institutes, in the context of asserting that the Roman Catholic Church is corrupt in all kinds of ways, he says, quote, when we categorically deny to the papists the title of the church, we do not for this reason impugn the existence of churches among them, end quote. So they're on the one hand, it's like this very tricky thing. There's these just brutal criticisms of the leadership, the hierarchy. They're calling them ravenous wolves. It's the Antichrist. It's worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. They're just ravaging the sheep. But then they're saying also there's churches there. There's true Christians and true churches there, and they're a part of the church. How do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, I'll point to another place. This is in Luther's Galatians commentary, where he's specifically speaking about the Pope being the Antichrist. So he's using some of the most harsh language toward Rome that you can imagine. But in that context, he talks about, Paul writing to the Thessalonians and speaking about the man of lawlessness who is in the temple of God. And he says, that's the Pope of Rome. But he makes this point. He says, but Paul does say that he's in the temple of God, as in he's in the church. So he makes pretty explicit that the criticism is that the devil has caused this wickedness from many in leadership within the medieval Roman Church, specifically the papacy. And I mean, any honest Roman Catholic historian is going to tell you that there was some pretty wicked stuff going on with the papacy in the medieval period. I mean, they got the nickname pornocracy that was known among the people commonly. I mean, it got pretty bad. So in saying that, he's not saying Rome is not church. It was never Luther's intention to say Rome was not church. And yeah, he's certainly not saying I'm the head of a new church and only my people are really believers. I mean, this is like a cult kind of mentality. Luther's not like a Joseph Smith figure. Luther's ultimate desire was always for this unity that eventually Rome would actually hear him out. I mean, his original desire was that he would just be able to have a conversation with the Roman leadership and the Lutherans would be able to present their case, and that they would actually have like an engaging debate and figure these issues out. He was very willing and desirous to do that, but Rome said no. So if you're, then asking the question, well, what about other churches? Say, the Eastern Orthodox Church. Early Lutherans often cited the Orthodox Church as an example of Christianity can exist without the Pope. Mm-hmm. Here's proof. We have the whole Eastern Church, and there was no doubt that they're a church. Luther speaks at one point highly of the Ethiopian church that they didn't even really have contact with at this time, but they knew of their existence. So Luther and the early reformers were very willing to say, of course, there are Christians outside of our groups, and that ended up actually being part of their argument against the claims of the papacy. Was they were the exclusivists, right? They were the ones saying you have to submit to the Bishop of Rome, or you're not in the church. And the reformers are the ones saying, no, the church is far broader than being under one particular bishop.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because I was going to read a quote from Calvin to this effect, and it really is interesting. If someone thinks the Protestants were coming along and saying, okay, now we're the church and we disregard everything else, rather than what they were saying, which is we're a renewal and reform initiative within the church, then how do you explain their appeal to what they called the Greek church, and they meant the Eastern Orthodox Church? In the Institutes, you can see how much I've marked up this page because I find it so fascinating. Calvin is right here, plain as day. He's in arguing against the Roman Catholic claim at the time of the 16th century that we are the one true church. He says, quote, they make the Greeks schismatics. With what right? because in withdrawing from the apostolic see, they lost their privilege. What? Would not they who fell away from Christ deserve it to lose it much more? This pretense of succession is in vain unless their descendants conserve safe and uncorrupted the truth of Christ, which they have received at their father's hands and abide in it. Now, there's a footnote where the editor notes that Luther held the same view on the Greek Church, Eastern Orthodox, and Luther in 1519 said, "Nothing more detestable than this blasphemy can be spoken," with reference to the idea that all the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, were damned. So what's interesting is that, today we don't necessarily wouldn't anticipate it's like this. The Protestants were being far more inclusive and generous to the Eastern traditions than the Roman Catholics of their own day, because the Roman Catholics said, no, you have to be under the Pope to be saved, and so they're damned. They're off the Ark of Noah. They're drowning in the waters. And the Protestants were saying, no, the Eastern Orthodox. And then you can see the Lutherans in the 1570s writing to the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, starting this dialogue and addressing him as a Christian. I don't know if you want to say anything more on this area.
Yeah, there's not a lot to say about that because those dialogues never really went far. They kind of died out pretty quickly. I would love to have seen that continue. I have all of these questions in my head of like, what if those conversations happened? But I know that there were even some Calvinist dialogues with the patriarch at one point as well. Such that there was at one point a Calvinist patriarch of Constantinople. It was
yeah. I think that was much later on. Yeah.
But that I wish that those conversations happened more.
I know
that space was up, but I think geographically, it's not like it is today. It's not quite as easy to have those conversations.
Yeah, that is to me one of the most fascinating episodes in all of church history, where you've got these two groups, Lutheran and Eastern Orthodox, in the 1570s. Talking, and I totally agree, and I will point out it was not the Lutherans who ended the dialogue. They had 3-letter correspondences back and forth, and basically Jeremiah II basically just said, "Don't write anymore." So it's like, okay, well, that kind of ends it. But they did carve out enormous agreement. They agreed on a lot, but there were those sticking points, and they weren't able to overcome those. But it just speaks to this question of, Protestantism is not saying it's us rather than everybody else. That's not the ideas were a reform effort in the church.